first speaker is Roy Beck. Roy is the founder and president and CEO of NumbersUSA, the largest national grassroots organization favoring reduced immigration and a stable U.S. population. He has reported on and worked on sustainability issues for over 40 years. During his work as a journalist, he was the recipient of more than 24 journalism awards, noting his work on the intersection of sustainability issues, ethics, religion, and public policy. Roy has authored several books on the effects of U.S. immigration policy on America's natural resources, quality of life, individual freedoms, and labor force. And he's here to discuss with us today the tragedy of the commons, why population reduction has become taboo. Roy Beck.
Those of you who are, I mean, I know most of you in here are presenters yourselves, and you know, I don't know if you ever had these dreams the night before of getting up to the podium and you forgot your notes at home, or the more common one, you get up there and you have no clothes on. That's kind of the way I feel today, because Leah would not let me bring my jar of gumballs, and I've pretty much sort of used that as my fig leaf for years. And so now I'm exposed for whatever words alone. No gumballs. Nor do I have the charts. I was going to put the red and green charts up, but Steve Camerata, they changed his topic. He's going to do that stuff. So this is what's left. No, my understanding is that it looked like I was going to set the stage, but Phil, you did that was a great way of setting the stage. I think I'm supposed to do a little bit more on the background. I know today is mainly about the future, and that's where we need to look. And unlike most of the people in Washington who live totally in the present, plan for the present. Well, I mean, the 2 years. There's a 2-year present, and that's kind of it. I know that just about everybody in this room are the kind of people who are planning for the future. So looking in the past, just a little bit on the background, you know, we added our first 100 million people in the United States, went from 4 million people in the first census, 1790, and added the first 100 million by just before World War I. And that was an incredible population growth. Interesting thing about that that I think most people really don't realize, because we hear so much about our immigration heritage, but as far as we can tell, there was never a year in that period of time when new immigrants and the burst immigrants were the majority of population growth. I mean, this country filled up because of incredible fertility of the people who had already arrived. And of course, believe me, the immigrants had large families too. But this was a fertility-driven population growth. So that was the first 100 million. The second 100 million came much faster, from World War I to about 1970. Now, most of us, well, those of us who are self-centered, the history all revolves around ourselves, and so I want to just revolve this around myself. In 1966, I entered the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Now, that was the same year that the Sierra Club president, David Brower, made the much-quoted observation when he says, "You don't have a conservation policy unless you have a population policy." And that was very, like many in this room, things like that, plus Paul Ehrlich's book on the population bomb. There's so many things happening in the late 60s that formed our understanding that makes us not shocked by what Phil just told us. I mean, we understand that. We understand the foundational formula, that it's the per capitas and the number of capitas that give us the bottom line. I ended up doing something rather strange, which was refuse to take one of the 800 beats that were assigned at the Columbia Missourian, because the journalism school students they manned the daily newspaper of the town, because the university owned the daily newspaper, and there were 800 beats. And I asked to not have one of those 800 beats. I asked to create something brand new called the environmental beat. And the editors, who are professional editors, not students, turned me down. They said, you know, not enough to write about. This is the late 1960s. Not enough to write about. But they gave me a 1-month grace period, and sure enough, I was able to find something to write about. That's where I learned a lot of my hoggish ways, because I was on the front page constantly, writing about the environment because the environmental movement was exploding. Well, within a couple of years, interesting enough, that was one of the first 10 newspaper environmental beats in the country. This is new stuff, environmentalism. There's conservationism before, but there had never been a conservationist beat, really. The Sierra Club mantra, that is David Brower's mantra, was everywhere. As a young reporter, and this is the reason I'm focusing on my experience, as a young reporter, when I covered environmental news, when I went to environmental experts, went to environmental groups, the need for both national, international, and local population stabilization was always brought up. So as a reporter, I had to really work hard to keep population from being in my environmental stories. So what was happening during that time? Well, in 1970, most of us, the foundational document for modern environmentalism is basically the National Environmental Policy Act, passed in 1970. That act began with an acknowledgement that the population was a central core issue in the environmental problems of the day. Senator Gaylord Nelson, I know many of you knew Senator Nelson, until the day he died earlier this last decade, emphasized that stabilizing global and U.S. population were a core part of the first Earth Day. We even have, I know at least one person in this room who was a member of the Rockefeller Commission. During that same time, there was this large bipartisan commission that was filled with business and business leaders, labor leaders, civil rights, environmental, religious, academic leaders who concluded that we would not be able to reach our environmental goals unless we began moving rapidly toward a U.S. population stabilization. I know I'm rehearsing this. I know all of you kind of know that, but it's just kind of helpful to just remind ourselves how incredible the population knowledge was within the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. And it wasn't like the population Tea Party movement against the government. The internal, the inside of government knew this. And it was, now, it's not without some opposition, but basically it became the perceived wisdom of the nation. And the basic idea was that we would move toward stabilizing our population by moving toward having a replacement level fertility and replacement level immigration. Replacement level fertility, 2.1 children per woman, and then replacement level immigration, which was at the time, somewhere around 250,000. But it was around what had been our traditional immigration average. For 200 years, we had averaged 250,000 immigrants a year, and in fact, during the 50s and 60s, it had been about 250,000 a year. But it was rising. By the time 1970 came, it was already rising because of a change in the Act in 1965. All right. So if that had been followed, we would have peaked, our total U.S. population would have peaked around 250 million people. The idea, the foundational ideas of population is, I can't really find, some of you may remember this, but I don't find that there was a specific target, like the United States should never go above 220 million or should never go above 280 million. I don't find that a number was picked. I think it would have been better if somebody had picked a number. But one thing that seems to be clear everywhere is that the United States should never add a third 100 million. President Nixon at least said, we certainly should not add the third 100 million anywhere as fast as we added the second 100 million. But the idea, we would never hit that 300 million mark. Well, in fact, as you know, was it 3 years ago? Yeah, I think 3 years ago, we hit the third 300 million. The 1990s were the biggest population explosion in U.S. history. And a professor looked at some things like you did, Phil. Professor Mayer of the University of Southwestern Louisiana conducted a study in the late 1990s in the middle of this huge population explosion. By the way, we're growing just a little bit less this decade. I mean, I guess we're just going to be the second biggest population explosion over history in the 2000 to 2010 mark. Professor Mayer did a study of newspaper reporting on water issues, urban sprawl issues, extinction, species issues, all kinds of issues that certainly in the 60s and 70s you would have expected that population would be mentioned. And he randomly picked 150 stories out of this bunch, and he and his grad students went through all of these studies. Out of 150 stories about these resource shortage issues, he found one story that mentioned population growth. Now, you know, I think a lot of people in this room have asked this question for years, like, what happened? How could that possibly happen? I mean, whenever the goals that had been set in the 60s and 70s environmental movement were so incredibly dashed, shattered. Not shattered like we passed them and we're doing better, but shattered in the sense they just didn't exist anymore. So my profession, certainly comes under scrutiny here. He interviewed the reporters, though, and it turned out that most of the reporters, when he talked to them, were not like incredulous when he brought up population. He goes, oh, yeah, I mean, population growth certainly is a part of this issue. But what the reporters told him was there's two things. One of them, it seemed to them that the population growth was inevitable. Why waste, you only allowed 18 inches of this story. Why would you waste any inches in the story about something that's inevitable? You want to talk about things that you can do. But the most important finding was, as he talked to reporters, he said, for us to add population into the stories it would be without attribution. We don't have anybody to quote. There's nobody talking about this. Well, you see this incredible difference between when I started as a reporter in the late 1960s and the 1990s. In 30 years, it had gone from where an environmental reporter or any kind of a resource reporter, it would have to work hard to get it out of the story. And by the 1990s, you would have to become really an advocacy journalist to even mention it, because nobody's talking about it. There's no institutions talking about it, bringing it up. So I used to say, as I spent 25 years as a newspaper reporter, if you want to say that bad journalism is due to bias and evilness, or is it due to laziness? And always go with laziness. That's what I always said. But and that's of course oversimplifying it. But the fact is that without institutions and major leaders talking about this all the time, it disappears from the public square. So that's the kind of the background setting that I think that drives most of us to be here today, and that is this has to change. I mean, now we're 40 years past Earth Day, and we're so much worse off, both in terms of the size of the population, the inability to be sustainable, but also in terms of the public education. How do we change that?